She wore her oldest dress to greet a stranger. She did not know the Duke was testing her heart. Autumn arrived at Ashcombe Hall the way an unpaid creditor arrives at a house that has been pretending, for months, that it is not in debt. It did not knock. It did not wait. It came through every draft in every window, laid itself down on every stone step, and settled into the corners of every room as though it had been promised a bed. The trees along the lower drive shed their color into the gravel without ceremony, and the wind carried the scent of turned earth and coal smoke, and something older than either, something that smelled the way old money smells after it has become no money at all. In the east wing, where the roof had been given up on 2 winters ago, the rain had begun to speak with its own small voice, a patient dripping into pans set out by servants who no longer expected anyone to fix anything. In the west wing, where the family still lived, the fires were laid thinly, and the candles were counted, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Palmer, had begun the quiet, private habit of eating only once a day so that the girls upstairs might have butter for their bread. Louisa Ashcombe had learned to move through the house the way one moves through a sick room. She woke early, before the maids, and dressed herself without help, because there was no help to be had. She did not ring for water. She fetched it. She did not ring for bread. She sliced it. She had learned, over the last 3 years, that a house on the edge of ruin is quieter than a prosperous house, and that the quiet requires a kind of attention that the loud years had never asked of her. She listened. She noticed. She knew which floorboard on the second landing had gone soft, and she knew which sash in the yellow parlor had swelled with damp, and she knew, without being told, which of the 2 remaining stable boys had been sleeping in the tack room because his mother could no longer feed him. She carried a piece of bread in her apron pocket for the old gray lurcher who lived in the stable, and she gave it to him every morning, and she did not tell anyone, because kindness in that house had become a private currency, and she was careful with it. Her father called her plain. He did not mean it cruelly. He meant it the way a man means a thing he has said so many times that it has stopped being an opinion and become a fact. Sir Henry Ashcombe was a man who had been handsome once, and he had married a beautiful woman once, and he had produced, in a burst of expensive optimism, 2 daughters. The elder, Cecily, had been the finished portrait of that optimism, golden, laughing, precisely the color of a good harvest. The younger, Louisa, had arrived quieter, browner, smaller, with her mother's gray eyes and none of her mother's fire. And Sir Henry, who had been counting on a second Cecily, had spent the next 20 years politely disappointed. He had never been cruel. He had only been elsewhere. And in a house that had begun, slowly and then suddenly, to lose its money, elsewhere was a form of abandonment as complete as any other. Cecily had done what a beauty is supposed to do in a house running out of money. She had gone to London for a season, and she had come home engaged to a viscount with a hunting lodge in Yorkshire, and a temper that his valet was already learning to fear. And she had done it all with the kind of clean, cheerful efficiency that made the entire county say, at parties, that Ashcombe had been saved. Ashcombe had not been saved. The Viscount's settlement had bought a new roof for the east wing, which had been promptly stolen by the man contracted to lay it, and had paid 2 years of a mortgage that had 4 years still to run, and had bought Sir Henry a new hunter that had gone lame in 3 months. What was left of the settlement had been eaten by the interest on interest, and now, in the autumn of Louisa's 22nd year, there was, at Ashcombe, precisely 1 asset left that could be turned into money. Louisa knew what she was. She had known for a long time. She was the second daughter of a ruined baronet, and she was plain, and she was 22, and she was the last piece of silver on the sideboard. And one day her father would decide to sell her, and she would go, because she loved him even now, and because she loved the house, and because there was, in her, a bone-deep, quiet, entirely unromantic understanding that a woman without a fortune has, in the end, only two currencies, and beauty was not one of hers. She had, in fact, three dresses. One was a morning gown of pale muslin that had been turned twice, and the second was a black dinner dress that had been her mother's, and that no amount of taking in had made fit properly across the shoulders. She wore the muslin in the mornings and the black at supper, and by the second year of the house's quiet ruin she had grown so used to them that she thought of them the way one thinks of the two chairs that stand without ever being remarked on either side of a fire. She had one dress that was not mended. It was gray, a soft dove-gray wool, plain at the collar and plain at the cuff, and it had been made for her by Mrs. Palmer 3 years ago out of the last untouched bolt in the linen room. It fit her the way a well-loved thing fits, not perfectly, but truly. She wore it on Sundays, and she wore it whenever her father entertained, and she had come to think of it as her only remaining piece of dignity. She kept it hung on the back of the door where the mice could not reach it, and she brushed it every night with a stiff horsehair brush that had belonged to her mother, and she thought of it, without ever saying so, as the last honest thing in the house. The letter came on a Tuesday. It came with the second post, which at Ashcombe now meant mid-afternoon, delivered by a boy from the village who had learned to walk very slowly past the kitchen door in the hope of a slice of bread. Louisa was in the yellow parlor when her father opened it, seated at the pianoforte, not playing, only running her fingers along the keys without pressing them, because the instrument had gone out of tune 3 winters ago, and there was no money to have it seen to. She heard the paper crack. She heard her father breathe in, and then out, and then in again. And she knew, before he had spoken a word, that the letter was the thing they had been waiting for, without naming. He came into the parlor with the letter still in his hand. He did not sit. He stood in front of the fireplace, where he always stood when he was about to say something he did not wish to say, and he looked, for the first time in a long time, directly at her. And she saw, in his face, a thing she had not expected to see, which was that he was frightened. "The Duke of Velmore," he said, "is coming to Ashcombe on Friday." She waited. She had learned, in this house, that a sentence her father did not want to finish was best not helped along. "He is a friend," her father said, "of a friend. He has expressed an interest in seeing the property and in meeting the family." She understood. She understood immediately, the way one understands, on the point of drowning, that the shore is farther than it looked. There was one daughter left at Ashcombe who was unmarried. There was one asset left that could be turned into money. The Duke of Velmore, whom she had never met, whose name she had heard perhaps twice in her life at London parties her sister had described to her afterward, was coming to Ashcombe on Friday. And he had expressed an interest, and men of that rank did not express interests without meaning them. "Papa," she said very quietly, "am I to understand that His Grace is coming to look at me?" Her father did not answer. He looked at the fire, which was not burning well, and he set the letter down on the mantel, and he said, in a voice she had not heard from him since her mother had died, "He is a good man, Louisa. He is said to be a good man, and we cannot go on as we are." She nodded. She did not cry. Crying, in her experience, had never yet produced money, and she had, some years ago, quietly stopped attempting it. She rose from the pianoforte, and she smoothed her skirt with hands that had gone perfectly steady, and she said, "Then I shall have Mrs. Palmer prepare the blue room for His Grace, and I shall be ready to receive him." She did not, at any point in that conversation, ask what would happen if the Duke did not like her. She already knew. That night, in her own small room at the end of the corridor, she took her gray dress down from the back of the door and she laid it out on the bed. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about what a duke's wife was supposed to look like, and she thought about what her sister had looked like the night before she left for her season, in her new white silk, with pearls in her hair. And then she thought about the fact that she did not own a white silk, and she did not own any pearls, and she owned, in point of fact, 3 dresses, of which one was a plain morning gown of muslin that had been turned twice, and one was a black dinner dress that had been her mother's, and that no amount of taking in had made fit properly, and one was this soft, plain, dove-gray wool, with the plain collar and the plain cuffs, the last honest thing in the house. She could borrow. Her sister had left behind 2 silks in the wardrobe of the pink bedroom, and Louisa, if she chose, could have Mrs. Palmer alter one for Friday. She could powder her hair, she could pinch her cheeks. She could arrange, on Friday morning, to be, as her father would have put it once, presentable. She could try to be a Cecily for one afternoon, for one man, for the sake of a house. She stood in her chemise in the cold, and she looked at the gray dress on the bed, and she thought about the last honest thing in the house. And then she made her decision. It was the decision of a girl who had been told all her life that she was plain, and who had understood at some point in the last 3 years that a lie told for the sake of a man was still a lie, and that a marriage built on a borrowed silk was still a marriage built on a borrowed thing. She thought, if he is a good man, as my father says, then he must see me, and if he cannot see me, then he is not a good man, and the whole of this is a farce, and I shall have signed my life over to a stranger for the sake of a roof. She thought, I have one dress that is mine. I shall wear it. She hung the gray dress back on the door. She got into bed. She lay awake until the fire in the grate had gone out entirely, and then she lay awake a little longer, listening to the rain speak its patient sentence in the east wing. And she thought about what she would say to a duke, and she found that she had, in the end, nothing prepared. She thought at last, just before she slept, let him see what is here. If it is not enough, it was never going to be enough. She did not know that, on Friday morning, the man who arrived at Ashcombe would not be the man her father was expecting. 200 miles away, in a study lined with books whose spines had gone soft with reading, the 7th Duke of Velmore was writing a letter he did not intend to send. Adrian Hartley Rowntree, Duke of Velmore, was 31 years old, and he had, in the last 18 months, received 47 letters from mothers with unmarried daughters, and 31 letters from fathers with mortgaged estates, and 9 letters from men who claimed to be old family friends and who had, in fact, never met his father in their lives. He had answered none of them. He had answered none of them because he had come, over the course of that 18 months, to a conclusion so precise that it had begun to feel like the only true thing he owned. The conclusion was this, that a duke does not know, ever, whether the woman across the drawing room from him is looking at him or at his coronet, and that the coronet, on any given day, is by far the more visible of the two. He had watched his elder brother, the 6th Duke, marry a woman who had loved the title and hated the man, and he had watched that marriage curdle over 8 years into something that had killed his brother in the end, more surely than the fall from the horse that had officially done it. He had watched his mother at Velmore in her widowhood mourn a son whose wife had already, before the black had come off her sleeves, remarried a man of larger fortune. And he had decided, standing at his brother's grave in the wet November grass, that he would not do it, that he would not sit in a drawing room in a coat of superfine and let a girl he had never met, and her mother, and her father, and her aunts, and her second cousins, arrange their faces at him, that he would not be looked at as a title, that whatever he did, whenever he did it, he would find, first, a woman who could not see the coronet, because she had not yet been told it was there. His steward, Mr. Fenn, thought he was mad. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, thought he was in mourning. His closest friend, Colonel James Whitcomb, thought he was, at last, correct. The letter he was writing, and did not intend to send, was to his mother. It said, "I have decided to go to Ashcombe as Fenn's clerk. Sir Henry Ashcombe believes he is receiving the Duke of Velmore on Friday. He will receive, instead, a man in a plain coat, a man with dust on his boots, a man who has come, he will be told, to inspect the property in advance of his Grace's arrival next week. He will show me the estate. He will show me his daughter. She will not know who I am. She will look at me, or she will not. She will speak to me, or she will not. And I shall see in an afternoon more than a duke sees in a year of drawing rooms." He did not send the letter. He folded it. He put it into the drawer of his writing desk. He rang for his valet, and he asked to be shown the plainest coat in his wardrobe, and the plainest boots, and a hat of no particular quality. And when his valet, whose name was Peters, hesitated, Adrian said very quietly, "Peters, I mean it. If you dress me as a duke on Friday, I shall dismiss you on Saturday. Dress me as a man." Peters, who had been in the family since Adrian was 7, and who had loved the elder brother, and who had watched what had happened, and who understood more than dukes generally credit their valets with understanding, bowed and said, "Very good, your grace," and went, without any further argument, to lay out a coat of plain dark wool that had, once, belonged to Mr. Fenn. On Friday morning at Ashcombe, the sky was the color of an old shilling. It had rained in the night, and the gravel drive was dark with wet, and the last leaves on the lime avenue hung the way tired flags hang, without conviction. Louisa was in the kitchen at 6. She had helped Mrs. Palmer with the bread, and she had gone out herself to the kitchen garden and cut, with her own hands, the last of the late time, because the pheasant her father had somehow procured for the Duke's luncheon would be improved by it. She had walked down to the stable to feed the old lurcher his bread. She had spoken to the 2 remaining stable boys, and had learned that the elder had been up since 4, polishing what tack was left, because he had understood, even without being told, that today was a day on which the house was being looked at. She washed her hands, she combed her hair, and she put it up plainly, in a knot at the nape of her neck, with no ornament. She looked at herself in the small speckled glass on her chest of drawers, and she saw a young woman with her mother's gray eyes and her own quiet mouth and no particular color in her cheeks. And she put on the gray dress. She fastened the small plain buttons at the wrist. She smoothed the plain cuffs. And she went downstairs, quietly, the way she went downstairs every morning of her life, to be, as her father would say, presentable. The man arrived at 11. He came on horseback, alone, without a groom. He wore a coat of plain dark wool. His boots were dusty. His hat, which he took off in the hall, was the hat of a man who had ridden in it in the rain more than once. He gave his name to Mrs. Palmer as Mr. Roundtree, from Mr. Fenn's office, come on behalf of His Grace to look over the property in advance of His Grace's visit the following week. Mrs. Palmer, who had been expecting a duke, and who was therefore expecting a carriage, was momentarily thrown. But Mrs. Palmer had been in service for 39 years, and she recovered, and she took the hat, and she showed Mr. Roundtree into the yellow parlor, where Sir Henry Ashcombe was pacing in front of a poor fire. Sir Henry, when he understood what had happened, was momentarily furious. A clerk. A clerk had been sent on Friday without warning in the place of the Duke. He controlled himself. He had been controlling himself for a long time. He had been controlling himself since the letter from his solicitor last spring, and he controlled himself now. And he offered Mr. Roundtree a chair, and Mr. Roundtree took it, and Sir Henry, having taken the chair opposite, made polite conversation about the weather and the road and the state of Mr. Fenn's rheumatism, and the whole while he was thinking, quite clearly, "This is an insult, and I shall have to swallow it, because I cannot afford to be insulted." Adrian, seated across from him in the plain coat, with the dust of the road still on his boots, was not thinking about Sir Henry at all. He was thinking about the girl. She had come into the parlor a moment after him, quietly, without being announced. She had curtsied, briefly, to him, as she would have curtsied to any visiting man of business. She had said, in a voice that was low and clear and without any theatrical warmth at all, "Mr. Rowntree, my father has told me you are come from his Grace's office. You must be tired from the ride. May I offer you something?" She had not looked at his coat. She had not looked at his boots. She had looked, briefly, at his face, and then at the pot on the tray, and she had, without waiting for an answer, poured him a cup of tea and set it on the small table at his elbow, and stepped back. She was wearing a gray dress. It was, he understood immediately, not a dress that a woman puts on when she is expecting a duke. It was a dress that a woman puts on when she is expecting a working morning. It was plain at the collar. It was plain at the cuff. It had been mended once, at the elbow, with a stitch so small he only saw it because he had already begun to look at her. Her hair was plain. Her hands were plain. Her face was plain. In the sense that plainness had, at some point in his brother's marriage, come to mean, to him, unornamented, and therefore honest. He said, "Thank you, Miss Ashcombe." And he watched her over the rim of the teacup, and he thought, "She has no idea. She thinks I am a clerk. She has poured me a cup of tea in her plainest dress, without arranging her face, without arranging her hair, without arranging her voice, and she has spoken to me as she would have spoken to a man from an office." And in that same moment, a second, quieter thought arrived, and stayed, and did not leave him. "I have found what I came looking for. I have found it in the first 10 minutes. I do not yet know what to do with it." Sir Henry, who had been waiting for his daughter to charm the clerk in some useful way, was on the verge of despair. He suggested, with a heartiness that fooled no one in the room, that Miss Ashcombe show Mr. Rowntree the long gallery and the library, since Mr. Rowntree had been sent to look at the property, and since his Grace, when he came, would surely wish to have heard already about the finer features of the house. Louisa, who understood her father perfectly, and who was, in her private mind, mortified for him, said only, "Of course, Papa," and rose, and gestured, and Adrian rose with her, and the two of them went, without any further conversation, out of the yellow parlor and into the long, cold, half-lit corridor that ran the length of the west wing. She showed him the house honestly. That is the sentence that stayed with him afterwards, when he sat in his room at the village inn that night and tried to explain to himself, on paper, what had happened. She showed him the house honestly. She did not pretend the east wing did not exist. She took him to the door of it, and she opened the door, and she showed him the ceiling in the corner where the plaster had come down, and she said, "This is what the settlement was meant to repair. The man contracted to repair it left in the second month with the money. My father does not speak of it, but you will be asked, no doubt, by Mr. Fenn, and so you should see it." She took him to the library, where 2 of the tallest shelves had been emptied and the books sold, and she said, "The Bunyan and the Richardson and the Fielding are gone. My father sold them last winter to pay the coalman. I tell you because His Grace, if he comes, will look at the shelves, and he will see the empty places." She took him to the long gallery, and she named the portraits, honestly, and where a portrait had been sold, she said so. "That is my grandmother. That was my great-uncle Frederick. That empty place was a Lely, sold 6 years ago. That place was a Reynolds, sold 4. She did not apologize for any of it. She did not blush. She simply named it. And in a house that had, for 3 years, been organizing itself around the fiction that everything was as it had been, the simple fact of a young woman naming, aloud, to a stranger, what had been lost, was to Adrian the most extraordinary thing he had seen in a drawing room in the whole of his adult life. In the long gallery, at the empty place where the Reynolds had been, he stopped, and he said very quietly, "Miss Ashcombe, may I ask you a question that is not, strictly speaking, my business?" She said, "You may ask, Mr. Rowntree. I do not promise to answer." He said, "Why did you tell me? About the Bunyan, about the Reynolds. You could have said the shelves were being rearranged. You could have said the portrait was at the framer's. Any young woman in your position, meeting a clerk in advance of a duke, would have arranged the truth. Why did you not?" She looked at him for a long moment. She had, he noticed, her hands folded in front of her, in the plain cuffs, and she was standing very straight, and her face was not, at all, the face of a woman who was trying to be seen. She said, "Because if His Grace is coming here to make a decision about our family, it will help no one if his decision is made on the basis of a lie. My father will not tell him. My father cannot. But I can, and so I will. If your master is a good man, he will want the truth. And if he is not a good man, then it does not matter what any of us tells him." She paused. She said more quietly, "And I would rather be poor honestly than saved by a lie. I have discovered, in the last 3 years, that this is not a common opinion, but it is mine." He did not answer her at once. He turned, instead, and he looked at the empty place on the wall where the Reynolds had been. He thought, "My brother's wife would have papered that wall with a lie and gone in to dinner." He thought, "My mother, who is the most honest woman I have ever known, would have named it exactly as this girl has just named it." He thought, "I have been looking for 18 months in every drawing room in London for a woman who would tell me the truth about an empty place on a wall. And I have found her on a Friday morning in Wiltshire in a grey dress, and she does not know who I am." He said, still looking at the wall, "Miss Ashcombe, I think His Grace will be very glad to have come to Ashcombe." And she, standing beside him, understanding none of it, thinking only that this quiet, dusty, plain-coated man of business had said, in his own way, that the day had not been a disaster, said simply, "I hope so, Mr. Rowntree. My father is a good man. He does not deserve what has happened to him." He rode away from Ashcombe that afternoon at 3. He rode to the village. He stayed the night at the Ashcombe Arms, in a small room over the tap-room, and he wrote 3 letters. The first was to Mr. Fenn, in London, instructing him to draw up a marriage settlement. The second was to his mother, at Velmore, saying only, "I have found her. She is not what any of you expected. She is exactly what I wanted." The third was to Sir Henry Ashcombe. It was delivered by the ostler's boy the following morning. It said, in a hand that Sir Henry did not at first recognize, and then, halfway down the page, understood with a shock that made him sit down very suddenly in the chair by the fire. "Sir Henry, I owe you an apology, which I offer without qualification. The clerk who called upon you yesterday was myself. I came in that manner because I wished, once in my life, to be seen by a young woman for what I am rather than for what I have. Your daughter met me with a courtesy and an honesty that I have not encountered elsewhere in a year of trying. If she can be prevailed upon to hear me, I should like to return to Ashcombe on Monday, in my own name, and to ask, of you and of her, what I came here in disguise to discover the answer to." Velmore. Sir Henry read the letter twice. Then he read it a third time. Then he stood up. Then he sat down. Then he called for Louisa. She came in the grey dress. She had not, in fact, taken it off since Friday. She had washed the collar and brushed it, and put it back on, because she had felt, without being able to say why, that the wearing of it on Friday had been the first truly important thing she had done in her life, and she did not want yet, to give the feeling up. Her father did not speak. He handed her the letter. She read it standing. When she had finished, she read it again. And then, for the first time in 3 years, she cried. But only for a moment, and only because a thing she had not permitted herself to hope for, because she had not known how to name it, had just happened, quietly, on a plain sheet of paper, in the second post from a village inn. The days between the Friday and the Monday were, for Louisa, of a strange and suspended quality. Ashcombe went on. Mrs. Palmer went on making the bread. The lurcher went on receiving his heel of it in the stable-yard in the mornings. Sir Henry, having read the letter and having sat down and stood up several times, went about his ordinary business in the ordinary way, though at supper on the Saturday he reached, without saying so, twice, for his younger daughter's hand across the table, and on the Sunday morning at church, when the vicar read the lesson of the woman at the well, he was seen to close his eyes for slightly longer than usual. Louisa, for her part, walked. She walked the length of the lower drive on the Saturday and the length of the top field on the Sunday, in the grey dress, without a bonnet. And she thought, as she walked, about nothing in particular, which was, she understood, the first true thinking she had done in 3 years. On the Monday morning, she came down to the yellow parlor in the grey dress, brushed and rebrushed, and she waited. The Duke of Velmore returned to Ashcombe on Monday. He came in a carriage this time, and in his own coat, which was, in fact, not very much finer than the one he had ridden in on Friday, because he had, all his life, disliked being conspicuous. He was received in the yellow parlor. Louisa met him standing. She was wearing, again, the grey dress. She did not curtsy any lower for him this time than she had the first, and he noticed, and he was, silently, delighted. He said, "Miss Ashcombe, I owe you an apology, which I hope you will permit me to make in person before I say anything else." She said, "Your Grace, you owe me nothing. You came in the plain coat because you wished to know if I was honest. I wore the grey dress because I wished to know if you were kind. It seems we have both had our answer." He looked at her. He was, for a moment, unable to speak. And then he laughed, a real laugh, the first one he had laughed in his own house, or anyone else's, since his brother had died. And he said, "Miss Ashcombe, I came here to propose a bargain. I no longer wish to propose a bargain. I wish to propose a marriage. I shall ask your father in a moment. I ask you first, because it seemed to me, on Friday, that if I did not ask you first, I should have understood nothing at all." She said quietly, "Yes, Your Grace. If you will have me, as I am, yes." He said, "It is precisely as you are that I want you."
She married him 3 weeks later. It was a small wedding. It was held in the parish church at Ashcombe, on a morning of thin bright sun after a week of rain, and Louisa wore not a new white silk but a new gown of soft ivory wool that Adrian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, had sent down from London with a short letter that said only, "I have been told by my son that you did not wear a borrowed silk to meet him. I send you this dress not as a replacement for the grey one but as a companion to it. Please do not powder your hair." Evie Louisa read the letter and she folded it, and she put it into the small carved box on her dressing table where she kept the 2 things that mattered to her, and she wore the ivory wool, and she did not powder her hair. Her father gave her away. He wept, briefly, at the altar, and no one minded, and Adrian, standing at the front of the church in a coat only slightly finer than Mr. Fenn's, wept a little too, though only Louisa saw it. They went to Velmore that afternoon. The carriage was very fine. The horses were very fine. The road was long. Louisa, who had never been so far north in her life, sat very still, and watched the country change through the window, and thought about her old grey dress, which she had brought with her, folded in the bottom of the trunk beneath her books, because she had not been able to bring herself to leave it behind. Velmore Castle rose out of the moor at dusk on the second day of their journey. It was larger than she had imagined. It was older than she had imagined. It was colder than she had imagined. and it was not, at first, in any way her home. Adrian, who had told her at the wedding that he loved her, and who had said it again, quietly in the carriage on the second morning of the journey, became, in his own house, a different man. He did not stop being kind. He was, in fact, scrupulously kind. He was present at breakfast. He was present at dinner. He was courteous, always. He asked after her comfort. He asked after her rides. He inquired, gravely, whether the fires in her rooms were being laid to her satisfaction. He kissed her hand at the door of her sitting room every evening before he retired, and he wished her a good night, and he did not come in. He did not come in for the first week. He did not come in for the second. He did not come in for the third. And Louisa, who had not known precisely what to expect of a marriage, and who had trusted, on the strength of the plaincoat visit and the letter and the wedding, that whatever it was to be it would be true, discovered that being married to Adrian, Duke of Velmore, in his own house, was in most respects indistinguishable from being an honored guest in a very cold hotel. She did not complain. She did not have anyone to complain to. She wrote to her father every week cheerful letters, describing the moor, the horses, the tenants, the schoolroom in the village that had a broken window she had promised to see to. She did not describe the long silent evenings in the yellow drawing room, where Adrian sat at one end with a book and she sat at the other end with a piece of mending, and no one spoke and the fire cracked, and the great case clock in the hall struck the hours, and the servants came in at 10 with candles, and Adrian rose and bowed and said, "Good night, Louisa," and she said, "Good night, Adrian," and he went out one door and she went out the other, and the fire was raked and the candles were carried away, and Velmore, which had been colder than she had imagined, became colder still. She did not know why. She had, for the first week, been too tired from the journey to think about it, and for the second week she had told herself, quite reasonably, that a man in his own house, having brought home a wife largely unknown to him, was likely to require a period of adjustment which it was not, in her view, her business to shorten by pressing him. But by the third week the pattern had become the pattern, and Louisa, who had learned in a ruined house to trust patterns above assurances, understood that whatever this was, it was not adjustment. It was withdrawal. And withdrawal, in a large cold house from a man she barely knew and had just married, was, she discovered, a thing that hurt in a specific and lonely way she had not been prepared for. It was not the loud pain of a slight. It was the quiet, low, continuous pain of a room in which the fire has not, quite, been laid to burn. She thought at first that she had done something wrong. She turned Friday morning at Ashcombe over in her mind. She turned the letter over in her mind. She turned the wedding over in her mind. She found, in each of them, nothing that she had done that she would not do again. She thought, at second, that he had been disappointed in her, that she had not, on closer inspection, been what he thought she had been, that the gray dress had been a novelty, and that novelties in the country wear thin very quickly. She looked at herself in the long glass in her dressing room, and she saw her mother's gray eyes and her own quiet mouth and no particular color in her cheeks, and she thought, "He has looked now at length, and he has decided." She did not weep. She had learned, some years ago, that weeping did not produce money, and she now added to the list of things weeping did not produce warmth in a great house, from a man who has withdrawn from you without saying why. What she did instead was what she had always done. She noticed. She listened. She learned. She did it in the mornings, walking the long corridors of Velmore before the maids had finished with the grates, when the house was still cold and the light in the windows was still the color of a knife. She did it in the afternoons, walking down to the home farm with a basket over her arm, learning the names of the milkers and the names of the shepherd's children and the name of the retired coachman who lived in the cottage at the end of the drive and who, she discovered, had taught Adrian to ride at the age of 4. She did it in the evenings, in the drawing room, over her mending, when the fire had settled and the house had settled and Adrian, at his end of the room, had turned another page of a book he was not, she suspected, entirely reading. She noticed that the tea in the morning came slightly stewed. She said nothing to Mrs. Barrow. She went, instead, down to the kitchen on a Thursday morning, and she stood in the doorway and she asked of the cook, quietly, whether she might, one morning, be shown how the kettle was set for the breakfast tray, and the cook, who had been the cook at Velmore for 19 years, and who had never been asked such a question by a duchess in her life, showed her, and in showing her, corrected, without either of them ever having to name the correction, the small thing that had been wrong. The tea, from the following morning, was not stewed. Adrian, drinking it, did not remark on the change. He did not need to. He noticed that his wife, from that week, had begun to be called Your Grace, in the kitchens, not with the flat courtesy of duty but with a particular careful inflection that suggested the kitchens had come, quietly, without conferring, to a decision about her. She noticed. She listened. She learned. She learned the names of the housekeeper's 3 undermaids. She learned the name of the head gardener's wife, and the name of the head gardener's wife's mother, who was ill, and she sent, in her own hand, on paper of no particular quality, a note down to the cottage with a jar of Mrs. Palmer's blackcurrant jelly, which she had brought with her from Ashcombe in the trunk with the grey dress. She learned that the library at Velmore, which was very large, was arranged in a way that had made sense to Adrian's father, and that had never been reorganized, and that made it, in practice, almost impossible to find anything. And she spent, in her second week at Velmore, 3 quiet afternoons walking the length of it, making a list on a piece of foolscap of every book on every shelf, and thinking about how she would, if it were hers to do, arrange them. She did not tell Adrian. She did not think it was her place. She learned that the estate carpenter's boy, a lad of about 12, had a stammer and had been laughed at once in the servants' hall by one of the footmen, and she made a point on the 3rd week of asking the boy in the stable-yard whether he could help her carry a basket up to the schoolroom in the village, because she had heard he was a strong lad and a careful one, and she did not once, on the walk, allow the boy to feel that the walk was for him, and she did not once, on the way back, when he had begun halfway, to speak to her in short, careful sentences, look at him with anything but the ordinary listening politeness she would have offered a duke. She did not tell Adrian about that either. She learned, most of all, that Velmore had, at its center, a woman she had not yet met. The Dowager Duchess of Velmore, Eleanor Rowntree, had written the note that had come with the ivory dress. She lived, Louisa understood, in the south wing, which was reached by a long stone corridor from the main hall, and she did not, she was told by the housekeeper, generally come out. She had not left the south wing, in point of fact, since her elder son had died. She took her meals there. She read there. She saw, on any given day, no one but her maid, her chaplain, and 3 times a week her physician. Louisa had been told, gently, by the housekeeper on her first day, that the dowager was not to be disturbed, and Louisa, who was well trained in the reading of a house, had understood immediately that the dowager not being disturbed was a rule of the house that had been made, and enforced, and never broken, and that she, as the new duchess, would be the first person in 3 years with the standing to break it. She did not break it at first. She waited. She wrote, in her second week, a short, careful note in her own hand, on plain paper, and she sent it down the stone corridor with the maid. It said, Your Grace, I have not yet had the honor of meeting you, and I do not wish to disturb your peace. I write only to thank you for the ivory dress, which I wore, and which fitted me exactly, and which I understand from my husband was chosen by you. I understand also from him that you selected it in the knowledge that I had, at my own home, a grey dress which I did not wish to give up. I have kept it. I brought it with me. It hangs in my dressing room. If at any time you should wish to receive me, I should be very glad to come. Louisa. She did not expect an answer. She received one that evening. It was very short. Said, My dear, come to tea tomorrow at 4. Et vous? She went. She wore the grey dress. She had not planned, at first, to wear it. She had put on, in the morning, one of the new dresses that had been made for her in London on the strength of Adrian's account. A soft blue wool that had been sent up 2 weeks before, and she had looked at herself in the glass, and she had thought, again, no. If the dowager is a woman who chose an ivory dress to be a companion to a grey one, then the grey one is what she has asked me to come in. And she had changed. And she had walked the length of the stone corridor in the grey dress, feeling, for the first time in 3 weeks, at Velmore, that she was herself. The dowager was small. She was small in the way old women of great houses are small, which is to say she had been tall once, and was now not. She had white hair, and the eyes of her son, and the same quiet mouth Louisa had learned, in 3 weeks, to watch for. She was seated by the fire in a chair too large for her. She did not rise. She said, "My dear, come here. Let me see you." And Louisa came and stood in front of her chair, and did not curtsy, because the dowager had not asked her to. The dowager looked at her for a long time. She looked at the grey dress. She looked at the plain collar and the plain cuff and the small mend at the elbow that Louisa had, in the last week, done herself on the assumption that no one at Velmore would notice, and that she did not, in any case, wish anyone to notice. The dowager saw the mend. She smiled. She said, "Sit down, my dear. Sit near the fire. You have come a long way, and my son, whom I love, has been, since you arrived, an idiot." Louisa did not know what to say. She sat. She said, "At last, your grace, I am sure his grace has not." "He has," said the dowager. "He has been an idiot. He is my son. I know when he is being an idiot. He is being an idiot now because he has, at last, met a person he does not know how to lose, and he has not yet worked out that the way to keep her is not to leave her alone in a drawing-room for 3 weeks. He will work it out. He is slow. He was slow as a boy, but he will get there." She paused. She said, "In the meantime, my dear, drink your tea, and tell me about the schoolroom in the village. I understand from the head gardener's wife's mother, whose blackcurrant jelly you sent, that you have taken an interest." Louisa, who had not known that the head gardener's wife's mother and the Dowager Duchess of Velmore were on speaking terms, and who was, in that moment, discovering that Velmore was in fact a smaller and more attentive house than she had understood it to be, told the dowager about the schoolroom. She told her about the broken window. She told her about the boy with the stammer. She told her about the library, and the list on the foolscap, and the way she would, if it were hers to do, arrange the shelves. She did not know she had been talking for an hour until the dowager rang for fresh tea, and the maid, coming in, curtsied to Louisa in a way that no maid at Velmore had, in 3 weeks, yet curtsied to her. She went back down the stone corridor that evening in the grey dress, and she thought, for the first time since her arrival at Velmore, that perhaps she was not, in fact, going to have to bear it alone. The thaw began at Velmore not with a speech and not with a scene, and not with any of the things a young woman is told in books to expect. It began with a table. It began, specifically, in the 5th week when Adrian, who had watched his wife silently, at the far end of the 22-foot dining table, cutting her pheasant into smaller and smaller pieces because she was too far away from him to hear anything he said without raising her voice, went, one morning, into the small breakfast room at the back of the house, where he had eaten his solitary breakfasts as a boy, and he stood there for a long time, and he looked at the small round table by the window at which 4 people might, at most, uncomfortably sit, and he thought about his wife. He thought about the plain coat. He thought about the grey dress. He thought about the moment in the long gallery when she had said, without any ornament at all, that she would rather be poor honestly than saved by a lie. He thought about the fact that he had brought her, on the strength of that moment, to a house in which she now sat, every evening, 22 feet away from him, at a table that had been designed to accommodate the elder Duke's dinners of 40, and that he had, for 5 weeks, allowed this to go on, because he had been, as his mother had put it, an idiot. He went, that afternoon, to the housekeeper. He said, "Mrs. Barrow, the small round table in the breakfast room. Have it moved into the dining room. Have the long table moved out. We shall use the round table in the evenings from now on. Her Grace and I will sit at it." Mrs. Barrow, who had been at Velmore for 34 years, and who had never, in her 34 years, been asked to move the long table, said only, "Very good, Your Grace." And she went and she did it. And when Louisa came down that evening, in the pale blue wool this time, because she had not been to see the dowager and had no particular reason for the grey, she stopped in the doorway of the dining room, and she saw the small round table laid for 2, in the middle of the great room, with the tall silver candlesticks on it, and Adrian standing behind one of the 2 chairs, and she understood, without a word being said, what had happened. She said quietly, "Adrian, what is this?" He said, "It is a table at which I can hear you." He paused. He said more quietly, "Louisa, I am sorry. I have been afraid of you. I did not know I was afraid until my mother told me I was. I have been afraid because you are the first person I have brought into this house who does not want a single thing that this house can give her, and I did not know what to do with that, and I have, as a consequence, given you nothing. I am sorry. Please sit down." She sat. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, Adrian. I do not mind the house. I never minded the house. I minded not knowing what I had done. He said, you had done nothing. You had done nothing but be what you were. I was slow. I am slow. Please forgive me. She said, I forgive you. She picked up her spoon. She smiled at him across the small round table, for the first time in 5 weeks, and Adrian, who had watched for 3 years his brother's marriage fall apart across a much longer table than this one, understood, with a clarity that undid him entirely, that he had, on the strength of one afternoon in Wiltshire, married a woman who would, if he did not further disgrace himself, save his life. They ate at the round table every night after that. In the beginning it felt, to both of them, like a thing they had been doing wrong for years and had only just been given permission to do rightly. The great dining room, with its long cold expanse of oak pushed against the far wall, changed its character entirely. The tall candlesticks threw their light in a small warm circle, and beyond the circle the room went softly dark, so that Louisa could sit at her plate and see her husband's face, and not, at the edge of her vision, the 22 feet of empty polished wood between them. Mrs. Barrow, who had at first thought the arrangement peculiar, took to laying the round table herself, with a particular small silver dish of salt that had belonged to Adrian's mother as a girl, and with the thin fluted glasses that had been kept, for a generation, in a cabinet no one had opened. And it was noticed in the servants' hall, without being said aloud, that her Grace and his Grace, at the small round table, laughed. It was not a common sound at Velmore. It had not been common since the elder Duke had died. It came back that autumn in small careful increments, over pheasant, over soup, over the plain apple tart Louisa had asked Mrs. Barrow to teach the pastry cook, and once, on a Tuesday, over Adrian's account of a tenant who had, in perfect earnestness, tried to pay his rent in geese. They talked. She told him about the library. He asked to see her list on the foolscap. She showed him. He said, reorganize it. Have Mrs. Barrow give you whatever help you need. She said, I do not need Mrs. Barrow. I need a stepladder and a fortnight. He laughed. She told him about the boy with the stammer. He said quietly, I did not know. She said, you would not have. You did not know, either, that the ceiling in the east wing at Ashcombe had come down. That is not a failing. It is a fact. Most masters of large houses do not know these things. It is why they have wives. He looked at her. He said, Louisa, you are not most wives. She said, Adrian, you are not, in fact, most husbands. It has taken me some weeks to notice. The dowager, when she was told about the round table, laughed for a full minute. She said to her maid, I told you, and I told you he would work it out. He is slow, but he gets there. And she sent up, the next morning, a small parcel to Louisa's dressing room. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a small painted miniature of a young man of about 17, with Adrian's mouth and someone else's eyes, and a short note that said only, this was Henry, my elder son. He would have liked you. I have not shown this to anyone in 3 years. Evie Louisa put it on her dressing table beside the small carved box, and she wept, briefly, alone, for a man she had never met, and then she washed her face, and she went down to dinner in the grey dress, because she had felt that the grey dress was the right dress in which to have received a miniature of a dead brother. Winter came to Velmore. The moor turned to iron. The lake at the foot of the terrace froze. The dowager began, 3 times a week, to take tea in the yellow drawing-room instead of in her own rooms, and Louisa, who had begun her days by walking down to the schoolroom in the village and had ended them by reading aloud to Adrian in the library, discovered that she was, in a way she had not expected, at Velmore happy. Not because Velmore had changed, but because she had been allowed at Velmore in the grey dress, and in the small round table, and in the miniature of Henry, and in the library she was quietly reorganizing shelf by shelf, to be entirely herself. Could not last. In the countryside, of course, it could have lasted forever. But the countryside was not the whole of Adrian's life, and it was not, in the end, the whole of Louisa's either. In February, when the ice on the lake began to break, and when the first snowdrops came up in the wood behind the chapel, the letter came from Adrian's aunt, Lady Constance Alverley, in London, saying that the family expected, of course, the new Duchess of Velmore to be presented in town at the opening of the season, and that she, Constance, had already, on their behalf, taken a house in Grosvenor Square for the months of April, May, and June. Adrian read the letter twice. He gave it to Louisa. She read it once. She said quietly, "Adrian, we must go, of course." He said, "We do not have to go." She said, "We do. Not because your aunt commands it. Because I am your wife and the world must, at some point, be shown that you have one. If we do not go now, they will invent us. It is easier to go and be seen than to be invented." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Louisa, do you know what a London season is?" She said, "I know what my sister told me it was. And I know what my father was afraid of in the year before he sent for me from Ashcombe. I know it will be very loud. And I know that I shall not, in the beginning, be liked. But we shall go, Adrian. We shall go, and we shall come home again. And Velmore will still be here." He said, "You are braver than I am." She said, "I am not. I have simply had more practice at being looked at." They went to London in the last week of March. The house in Grosvenor Square was very large. The servants were very grand. Lady Constance Alverley, who was Adrian's aunt on his mother's side, and who was, in her own opinion, the last serious Duchess of Velmore of any consequence, arrived within 20 minutes of their carriage, and inspected Louisa the way one inspects a horse that has been sent up for a market one is not sure one wishes to attend, and pronounced at the end of the inspection that Louisa was, well, that Louisa would do. That Louisa was not, at any rate, a disaster. Louisa, who had understood every word of the inspection, and had understood also that Lady Constance had said none of it out of malice but out of a genuine, undissembled belief that Adrian could and should have done better, said only, "I am sorry, Lady Constance, to have disappointed you. I shall endeavor not to embarrass Adrian. I do not promise more than that." Lady Constance looked at her. Something in Lady Constance shifted. Lady Constance said, more quietly, "My dear, I do not, in fact, expect embarrassment. I expect, at the worst, that people will underestimate you. That is a bearable disaster. Where are the pearls I shall send round tomorrow? I shall introduce you at the Ellsworth ball. We shall see." The pearls arrived. Louisa wore them. She wore them at the Ellsworth ball with a gown of deep sea-green silk that had been made for her in London the week they arrived, which was cut modestly, high at the neck, long at the sleeve, and which had been chosen, she had insisted, in a color that would not compete with any other gown in the room. It did not shimmer. It did not blaze. It was the color of a quiet lake at evening, and she wore it with the pearls Lady Constance had sent, and her hair up plainly, and she went on Adrian's arm into the Ellsworth ballroom, and the whole room, as such rooms do, turned and looked and made silently its judgment. The judgment was, at first, precisely what Lady Constance had predicted. Louisa was, well, Louisa would do. Louisa was not a disaster. And then, within 3 weeks, the judgment changed. Because Louisa did not, in London, do any of the things a new duchess is expected to do. She did not gamble. She did not flirt. She did not gossip. She did not take a young lieutenant as a friend, and she did not take a fashionable painter as a discovery, and she did not, at any dinner, at any point, allow herself to be drawn into a discussion of another woman's dress. She listened. She noticed. She learned, in 3 weeks, the names of 40 London women, and the names of their husbands, and the names of their children, and the names of the tenants on their smaller estates, and she asked of each of them careful, quiet, unornamented questions, and she remembered without effort every answer. The women, at first, did not know what to do with her. They had been prepared for a country beauty, or a country awkwardness, or a country ambition, and they had been prepared, in each case, with the small kindly cruelties by which London prepares itself for a new woman. And Louisa was none of the 3, and the small kindly cruelties, having no object, hung in the air of drawing-rooms for 3 weeks with nowhere to land. Lady Ellsworth, on the 2nd Tuesday, invited Louisa to a morning call and asked her, over the tea, whether she found London tiring, and Louisa said, honestly, that she found the noise of the streets unfamiliar but the company at Lady Ellsworth's table restful, and Lady Ellsworth, who had been prepared to dismiss her, revised her opinion between one biscuit and the next. Lady Marchmont, on the Friday, seated Louisa beside a small elderly woman whose husband had died in a naval action 40 years earlier, and who was, at most London tables, courteously ignored. And Louisa, without being told who the small elderly woman was, spent an hour asking her about the naval action, and about the ship, and about the widow's pensions, and at the end of the hour the small elderly woman, who had not, in 20 years, been asked a serious question at a London dinner, took Louisa's hand in both of hers and said, "Distinctly, my dear, you are a serious young woman. Do not let them talk you out of it." Lady Marchmont, who had seated Louisa there as a small experiment, and who had expected the experiment to be a modest failure, revised her opinion between the second course and the third. In this fashion, one by one, they began to like her. They began, without being able to say why, to invite her. They began to save her a chair at their tables. They began, at their own dinners, when they saw her come into the room, to feel unexpectedly calmer. And this, of course, was intolerable to Miss Georgiana Vale. Miss Vale was 24. Miss Vale was the only child of a very rich sugar merchant who had married, some years ago, the daughter of an impoverished earl, and Miss Vale had, on the strength of her father's money and her mother's connections, spent the last 3 seasons in London expecting, and being encouraged to expect, an offer from the Duke of Velmore. She had not received one. She had understood, in the year of Adrian's silence, that his silence was mourning, and she had waited patiently, and she had, without ever quite saying so aloud, arranged her whole life around the expectation that when he emerged from mourning he would, in the natural order of things, emerge into her drawing-room. He had not. He had, without warning, without any London appearance at all, married a girl no one in London had heard of, from a ruined baronetcy in Wiltshire, and had brought her to town in a sea-green silk that made every other woman in the Ellsworth ballroom, for reasons no one could quite explain, seem to be trying too hard. Miss Vale, whose grievance was legible, and whose hatred, as the Dowager would later put it, had nothing to do with Louisa and everything to do with her own thwarted ambition, began in April, at first slowly, and then with an accelerating, careful cruelty, to make the season difficult for the new Duchess of Velmore. It began small. A remark at a dinner about young women who had married very quickly. A comment at a musicale about a certain lack of accomplishment on the pianoforte among girls raised in the country. An observation at a breakfast that some of the newer duchesses were, of course, charming, if one did not mind that they had, in point of fact, been available at rather a discount. Louisa heard all of it. She had been trained at Ashcombe in the reading of a room, and she had learned, in the last 3 years, that the cruelty of women in drawing-rooms is more precise and more deniable than any other cruelty in the world. She did not respond. She smiled. She asked of Miss Vale, in her low, clear voice, at every one of these dinners, one careful, well-informed question about Miss Vale's mother's health, or her father's mill, or her aunt's charity for the widows of naval officers, and Miss Vale, who had been prepared to be answered in kind, found herself 3 times in a fortnight on the wrong footing, and hated Louisa for it more than she had hated her when she had come in. It escalated. The small remarks became targeted. A rumor began to circulate delicately in 3 or 4 drawing-rooms that Louisa Ashcombe had, in the year before her marriage, been very nearly engaged to a curate in Wiltshire, and that the curate had broken it off because of certain unspecified indiscretions. The rumor was untrue. It was so plainly untrue that Louisa, when Lady Constance, in a fury, brought it to her one morning at breakfast, laughed, briefly and dryly, and said only, "Constance, I have never spoken to the curate at Ashcombe more than twice in my life, and the second time was at my mother's funeral. If Miss Vale is reduced to inventing curates, we are winning." Lady Constance, who had come in prepared for tears, was so relieved that she poured Louisa a second cup of tea and said, "Child, you are, in the end, going to do." The rumor died. Another began. It was said, then, that the new Duchess of Velmore had been seen, in the village near Velmore, walking alone with the estate carpenter's boy, and that the walk had lasted the better part of an hour. The rumor, this time, was carefully constructed because it was true. Louisa had walked to the village with the boy with the stammer. She had done it once, and then, over the winter, 6 more times, because the boy had come to trust her, and because his stammer had begun, on those walks, in the presence of a woman who did not once look at him with pity, to lessen. Louisa understood, when the rumor reached her, exactly what Miss Vale was doing. She understood, also, that if she denied it, she would confirm that there was something to deny, that if she explained it, she would betray the boy, and that if she said nothing, the story would be permitted to grow. She said nothing. She waited. And she made, that evening, a decision which she did not share with Adrian, because she did not wish him to intervene, and because she understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was, in the end, her matter to answer. It came to its head at the Alverley ball, in the 3rd week of May. Lady Constance's own ball, the one Louisa could not decline, the one at which the whole of London that mattered would be present, the one at which Miss Georgiana Vale had, 3 days before, been overheard by a friend of Lady Constance's saying, to another friend of her own, that if the new Duchess of Velmore was going to be there, then she, Georgiana, was going to have something interesting to say before the night was out. Louisa dressed for the Alverley ball in the sea-green silk. She had thought, briefly, of wearing something newer, something bolder, something that would in some way answer Miss Vale. And then she had thought quite clearly, no. She thought, I shall not tonight be a costume. I shall be a person. And she wore the sea-green silk. And she wore the pearls Lady Constance had sent her in the first week. And she wore, folded very small in the small silk reticule at her wrist, one thing that she had brought from her dressing-room at Velmore that afternoon and that no one, not even Adrian, had seen her put in, a folded letter she had written that morning, addressed in her own hand. She and Adrian went in together. The ballroom was full. Lady Constance, in her element, received them. The music began. Louisa danced, first with Adrian, and then, in order, with the Marquis of Ellsworth and with Colonel Whitcomb, who had been at their wedding, and with one of Adrian's cousins, and then, at last, with a young man she did not know, young, tall, ambitious, from a manufacturing family in the north, a man who had been introduced to her by Lady Constance with a slight raise of the eyebrow that Louisa had, at the time, not understood. She understood halfway through the dance. The young man was Miss Vale's cousin. He had been, she gathered, in Miss Vale's ear for a week, and halfway down the second figure of the dance, he said to Louisa very quietly, in a tone that was almost regretful, Your Grace, I hope you will forgive me. I have been asked, by someone who has your interest very much at heart, to give you a piece of information before the evening is out. Concerns your husband. It concerns, in fact, the manner in which he came to meet you at Ashcombe last autumn. I understand, I am told, that His Grace, on that occasion, did not travel to Ashcombe under his own name. I understand he traveled in the guise of a man of business, and that he presented himself to your father, and to you under the name Mr. Rowntree, in order to look you over without your knowledge. I understand this deception was maintained for the whole of a day. I understand this is not known in London. I understand there are those who feel that London should know. He finished. He waited. Louisa did not miss a step in the figure. She said, in a voice pitched exactly to be heard by him and by no one else, Sir, I know exactly how my husband came to Ashcombe last autumn. I have known it since the morning after his visit, when he wrote to my father and to me from the village inn, admitted the disguise, apologized for it, and offered his true name. I would call that letter, in fact, one of the 2 documents on which our marriage rests. I have it with me tonight. If your cousin wishes to say to the whole of the Alverley ballroom what she has sent you to say to me on the dance floor, I shall be very glad to give the room the letter, and to let it decide for itself whether my husband deceived me. She may name the moment. I shall be waiting. The young man, who was not a fool, and who was, in fact, on his mother's side a man of some decency, went perfectly still. He completed the figure. He returned Louisa to her place. He said, at the edge of the floor, very quietly, Your Grace, I ask your pardon. I did not know the whole of the story. I will not, tonight or any other night, be the one who says it. And he bowed, and he stepped back, and he went very deliberately across the ballroom to speak to his cousin. Miss Vale, standing beside a pillar, in a gown of shimmering rose gold that had been the most expensive dress in the room until Louisa had come in the sea-green silk, saw him coming. She read his face. She understood, with a horror that came up her spine before it reached her expression, that the plan had failed. And in the horror, being what she was, and in that room and being watched, she made her single catastrophic decision. She did not wait for her cousin to reach her. She said, at a pitch designed to carry to the woman standing next to her, well, if he will not, someone must. I do not know how the rest of you feel, but I do not think the Duke of Velmore's wife should be permitted to stand there in that dress, in those pearls, in this ballroom, without London knowing that the whole of her marriage rests on a theatrical arrangement. His Grace, I am told on excellent authority, went to Ashcombe last autumn under a false name. He inspected the daughter as a stranger. He purchased her at a discount. And he has brought her among us as if she had been chosen. She was not chosen. She was tested, like a horse at a fair. And I, for one, do not think. She did not finish. Adrian, Duke of Velmore, who had been standing not 15 feet away, in conversation with the Marquis of Ellsworth, had heard, and had turned, and had crossed the floor in 5 strides, and the room, which had been full of music, was now full of silence, because the music itself, sensing what a whole ballroom senses when a duke crosses a floor in 5 strides, had faltered and thinned and stopped. Adrian did not raise his voice. He never, in his life, raised his voice. He said into the whole room, in a voice pitched only very slightly above ordinary conversation, and therefore heard, without exception, by every person in it, Miss Vale, you are correct in one particular and wrong in all the others. I went to Ashcombe last autumn under a false name. I did. I make no defense of it. It was the act of a man who had watched his elder brother marry a woman who loved his title and hated him, and who had decided, at his brother's grave, that he would not repeat the mistake. I went to Ashcombe as a clerk, in a plain coat, in the belief that I would see, in one afternoon, more than I had seen in a year of drawing rooms in this town. I was correct. I saw a young woman, in her plainest dress, tell a stranger honestly that her father had sold a Reynolds to pay the coalman. I saw her tell him me, where the ceiling of her father's house had come down. I saw her, without knowing who I was, without knowing that a title was in the room, offer a man from what she believed to be a steward's office a cup of tea, and speak to him with the same courtesy she would have offered a duke. I chose her not for her fortune because she had none. I chose her not for her connections because she had none. I chose her not for her performance because she gave none. I chose her not for a discount, Miss Vale. I chose her for the one quality this room, taken together, could not produce among the whole of you on a single afternoon of your combined efforts. I chose her for the truth. If any person present is scandalized by that, I invite them to leave. And I invite them to understand, before they do, that they will not, afterwards, be received at Velmore, in London or in the country, in this generation or the next. There was, for perhaps 4 seconds, no sound in the room at all. And then Louisa, who had stood, through the whole of it, quite still at Adrian's elbow, in the sea-green silk, with the pearls at her throat and the folded letter in her reticule, said quietly, in a voice that reached exactly as far as it needed to, Miss Vale, I do have the letter. I have carried it with me tonight. If you or any person in this room wishes to read it, I shall show it. It says, in my husband's own hand, that he came to Ashcombe in disguise, and that he is sorry, and that he wishes to return in his own name and ask my father, and me, whether we will have him. I said yes to the man who wrote that letter. I would say yes again tonight. I ask no one in this room to approve of what my husband did. I ask them only, before they judge it, to consider whether they have ever, in their lives, been chosen for anything other than what they carried on the outside of them. If they have, I shall be very glad to hear of it. If they have not, then perhaps they will forgive me for having been chosen, one afternoon in Wiltshire, for what I carried on the inside. The silence held for another moment. And then, from somewhere near the doors, an old, dry, precise woman's voice, which every person in the room recognized as belonging to the Dowager Countess of Ellsworth, who had come out of retirement for the first time in 11 years to attend her daughter's ball, said, distinctly, well done, child. Music, please. Constance, my dear, do have them play a waltz. The music began. Adrian took Louisa's hand. He led her, in front of the whole of London, to the middle of the floor, and he put his other hand at her waist, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and they danced. They danced badly, in point of fact. Adrian, in the 15 years of his adult life, had made a study of not being conspicuous on ballroom floors, and Louisa had learned country dances at a schoolroom pianoforte at Ashcombe, and neither of them was, by London standards, a good dancer. It did not matter. It did not matter at all. They danced, and the room watched, and Miss Georgiana Vale, standing beside the pillar in her rose-gold silk, understood, quite completely, that she had lost, and that she had lost publicly, and that London, which forgives many things, does not forgive the loss of a duke to a woman one has publicly tried to shame. Miss Vale left London the following week. She did not return for the rest of the season. Her father, who was not a fool and who had, that night, been in the card room and who had, on hearing the story afterwards, understood immediately the shape of what his daughter had done, took her, at the end of June, to the continent, and she did not, in the end, marry anyone at all, though she lived to be very old and became, in her way, an interesting person who had learned from what had happened to her something that Louisa, without ever having spoken to her again, would have wished, quietly, that she had learned. That night, in the small sitting room off the ballroom, after the last guests had gone, Adrian stood at the window and looked out into Grosvenor Square, and Louisa came in the sea-green silk and stood beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. He said, "At last, Louisa, I did not mean to make a speech." She said, "You did not make a speech. You told the truth. There is a difference." He said, "I have never done that before." She said, "I know." He turned to her. He said, "Louisa, I chose you on a Friday morning in Wiltshire because you told a stranger in a plain coat where the ceiling had come down. I told them tonight because I would rather never be received in a London drawing-room again than let a woman like Miss Vale rewrite the reason I love you. I chose you for the truth. I chose you not for a fortune. I chose you not for a name. I chose you not for a performance. I chose you for what you are. And I ask you tonight in this room quietly because I did not, when we married, ask you as I ought to have, whether you will have me again on those terms. Not the Duke. Not the coronet. Me. She looked at him. She said quietly, "Adrian, I have already had you on those terms. I had you the afternoon you rode away from Ashcombe in the plain coat. I had you the morning your letter came. I had you at the small round table. I have you now. I shall have you when we are old. You do not need to ask me again." He said, "I want to." She said, "Then ask me." He said, "Louisa, will you?" She said, "Yes." He kissed her. It was the first time he had kissed her in front of a window, or in a house that was not their own, or without saying good night first. He kissed her carefully, the way he did everything, and when he had finished he said, "Come home." They went home to Velmore the next week. They did not, in the end, finish the season. Lady Constance protested briefly, and then, having thought about it, did not. The story of the Alverley ball ran through London for a fortnight, and then it went, as such stories do, into the country, and then, in due course, into the memory of the town, and by the time Parliament rose in July it was, in London, a story people told at dinners about the year the Duke of Velmore had faced down Miss Vale in his aunt's ballroom for the sake of the girl he had met in the plain grey dress. Autumn came again to Velmore. It came the way autumn comes to that country. Slower than at Ashcombe, colder, more honest. The moor turned. The lake, which had unfrozen in April, began, in November, to freeze again. The dowager, who had not, in 3 years, spent an autumn out of her rooms, began to spend her afternoons in the yellow drawing-room, and, in the second week of October, to walk on her son's arm in the walled garden. The library, which Louisa had, over the course of a year, quietly reorganized, shelf by shelf, was finished in November. Adrian, who had been away for 3 days on estate business, came home on a Tuesday to find that his wife had, without telling him, opened on that same day a small schoolroom in the village at Velmore, modelled on the one at Ashcombe, and had installed in it the estate carpenter's boy as the assistant to the master, and had paid for the master out of a small, quiet, private line of her own household accounts that she had, she told him at dinner over the round table, been saving for a year for. Exactly that purpose. He said, "You did not tell me." She said, "I did not need to. It was mine to do. I did it. Are you angry?" He said, "Louisa, I have never, in my life, been less angry." The boy with the stammer stood, 6 weeks later, in front of the schoolroom, and he read aloud, without stammering once, a passage from a book of Louisa's own choosing, one which he had planted quietly in his lessons 3 months earlier, and which she had known, on the strength of the walk they had taken together at Velmore in the autumn of the previous year, would speak to him. She sat at the back of the room in the grey dress, which she had brought down from her dressing-room for the occasion, because it had felt to her that the grey dress was the right dress in which to hear the boy read. Adrian sat beside her. He held her hand. When the boy had finished, and the small class had clapped, and the boy's mother, in the last row, had wept quietly into her handkerchief, Adrian said, in Louisa's ear, so only she could hear Louisa, "You were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible. You were seen." You have been from the first Friday morning. You are being now. You will be in every room I ever walk into for the rest of my life. She turned her head. She looked at him. She said quietly, and you, Adrian, you have been seen too. Even when you thought no one was looking. I saw you in the plain coat before I knew there was a coronet. I should have seen you if there had never been one at all. They went home that afternoon in the pony trap, side by side. The old grey lurcher from Ashcombe, who had been shipped up to Velmore in the spring in a straw-lined crate, and who had, at 14, discovered the moor with the delighted disbelief of an old dog given a second country, ran alongside for the first quarter-mile and then, tired, was lifted into the trap. Louisa fed him a piece of bread out of her apron pocket. She had been carrying, all year, a piece of bread in her apron pocket, at Velmore as she had at Ashcombe, because habits of kindness, once formed, do not know that they have changed houses. That evening at Velmore, at the small round table, Louisa took the bread from her apron pocket, which was still, after a full day's walking, the small heel she had put there in the morning for the lurcher, and she looked at it for a moment before she gave it back to the kitchen. It was a small dry piece of bread. It was, in every sense that mattered, the same piece of bread she had been carrying since she was 17, since her first winter of the family's ruin, when she had begun the habit in the stable-yard at Ashcombe with a lurcher who had, at that time, been young. She thought, looking at it, that a person's life may be measured, if one is careful, by what she keeps in her pockets. She had kept, in her pockets at Ashcombe, a piece of bread for a dog and a small honest accounting of the losses of the house. She had kept, in her pockets at Velmore, the same. She thought, whatever else happens, I shall not, in the pockets of any of my dresses, ever again carry anything I would be ashamed to be seen carrying. She looked up. Adrian was watching her across the small round table. He said quietly, "What are you thinking?" She said, "About bread." He said, "Tell me." And she did, and he listened the way he had listened to the plan for the drainage, as though a piece of bread in a pocket were the whole of the history of the world. And in a private way that evening in that house it was. If you are enjoying this story, we will take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Winter at Velmore that year was long. It was the coldest winter, the tenants said, in 20 years. The lake froze so hard that the estate carpenter cut ice blocks out of it in January and stored them in the ice house against a summer no one, in January, could imagine. The dowager, who had not intended to see another spring, saw one. Louisa, who had suspected in November what she did not confirm until March, told Adrian, one evening at the small round table, that she was expecting a child. He did not say anything at first. He put down his glass. He got up. He walked around the small round table. He knelt beside her chair. He put his forehead against her hand. He said into her hand quietly, "Louisa, please do not, please be careful. Please be," she said, "Adrian. I shall be exactly as careful as any other woman in my position. I shall be no less careful and no more. I am not going anywhere. Sit down. Eat your dinner. Speak to me about the drainage in the south field because I have been thinking about it and I have an idea." He sat down. She spoke to him about the drainage in the south field. He listened. He listened, in point of fact, as though she were telling him the whole of the history of the world. And in a way she was, because a wife's plan for a piece of drainage on a country estate, told to a husband over a small round table by the light of 2 candles, is, in the private history of that marriage, as important as any battle in any book. He ate his dinner. She ate hers. And the drainage plan, in due course, was implemented, and the south field, in the following summer, produced a wheat crop that his father would have wept to see. The spring of that year was, by common agreement in the village, the warmest in a decade. The snowdrops came up in the wood behind the chapel in the 2nd week of February, and the primroses in the hedge along the lower drive were, by the middle of March, thick enough to gather. Louisa walked, most mornings, at first briskly and then more slowly, down the drive to the village and back, and Adrian, who had begun, without telling her, to arrange his estate business so that he might be at home for luncheon every day, walked with her when she would let him and stayed away when she preferred to walk alone. He had learned, over the year, that his wife's solitude was not a rejection of him but a form of her thinking, and he had learned, in the way that slow men eventually learn great things, that a marriage between 2 thinking people requires, on some mornings, that they think apart in order to speak in the evenings together. The dowager, who by that spring had become almost frail, sat in the walled garden in the afternoons in a rug and watched her daughter-in-law kneeling among the primroses, and did not say to anyone what she was thinking, which was that she had lived long enough, at last, to see her second son married to a woman who was in every important respect what her elder son's wife had not been. She would say it, before the end, to Louisa on a warm afternoon in July, in a sentence of 6 words that Louisa would remember for the whole of her life. But she did not say it yet. The child was a girl. She was born in September at Velmore, in the room that had been the dowager's mother's before her, and she was small and dark, and had her mother's gray eyes and her father's mouth, and they named her Henrietta, after Adrian's brother Henry, whom she would never know, and whose miniature Louisa took down from her dressing table on the morning of the christening and set on the low table beside the crib, so that the child, in whatever way an infant sees anything, might see the face of the uncle, whose name she carried. The dowager stood as her godmother. It was the last thing she did as a public figure. She died quietly in her sleep 3 weeks before her granddaughter's first birthday, with her hand on Louisa's hand, and with, at her bedside, the letter Louisa had sent her at Velmore in the first fortnight of her marriage, the plain note on plain paper, thanking her for the ivory dress, folded on the small table beside the miniature of Henry. She had kept it all that time. A year after that, Louisa, in the walled garden at Velmore, in the plain grey dress, which she had not yet given up, and which by then, patched twice more at the elbow, had, in her private ordering of the world, become the most important dress she owned, planted with the estate carpenter's boy, who was no longer a boy, but the assistant schoolmaster at the village school, and who had not stammered in nearly 2 years, a row of espaliered pear trees along the south wall. She said to him, kneeling in the earth, when these bear, Thomas, and they will bear in 5 or 6 years, we shall bring the school out to pick them. Every child in the village. Every year, he said, without stammering, and without hurrying, yes, your grace. I shall remember. The Duke of Velmore came out into the garden a little while later, carrying his daughter. He set her, in her small white dress, on the grass at the foot of the wall. Henrietta, who was 2 and who had, that summer, learned to walk, and who had also, that summer, learned that the old grey lurcher from Ashcombe was the finest thing in the world, put her hand on the lurcher's shoulder for balance, and stood and looked up and considered the pear trees and the wall and her mother in the grey dress, and her father in the plain coat, and she said, in the way 2-year-olds say things, without knowing yet that they will be remembered, Mamma. Adrian, watching from the path, said quietly into Louisa's ear, as he had said in a village schoolroom the year before her daughter was born, you were seen. Even when you thought you were invisible, you were seen. You have been. You are. You will be. And she will be too. Louisa looked up at him from the earth. She had a smudge of soil on her cheek. She had a plain grey sleeve rolled to the elbow. She was 31 years old, in the grey dress, in her own garden at Velmore, with her daughter on the grass and her husband in the plain coat and the old lurcher from her father's stable at her daughter's small hand. She said, Adrian, I know. I have known since the plain coat, and I shall know every day until the end. Because you told me, and you meant it, and you have kept telling me, in every room, every day. He said, I always will. She said, I know. The pear trees in 5 years bore fruit. Every child in the village came out and picked them. They came out again the year after and the year after that. The old grey lurcher from Ashcombe died in his sleep at 17, in the sun by the kitchen door at Velmore, and Henrietta, then 7, wept for a whole day, and was comforted by her mother in the grey dress, which by then had been patched a 3rd time, and would be patched again because Louisa had decided, long since, without ever needing to say so, that some dresses are not meant to be given up. Sir Henry Ashcombe lived long enough to walk his younger daughter's daughter down the aisle of the parish church at Velmore on the morning of her christening, and no further. He died the following spring at Ashcombe in the yellow parlour of nothing in particular, an old man who had, in the end, been forgiven for a great deal because he had, once, in a moment of terror, done the only right thing left to him, which was to let his younger daughter open the door in her grey dress. Cecily Ashcombe's marriage, in Yorkshire, was not, in the end, a happy one, but her husband died young enough that she was able, in her 30s, to come to Velmore for long summers with her children, and Louisa, who had never held her sister's beauty against her, welcomed her every summer, and taught her, over the course of a decade, that being seen and being looked at are not the same thing. Mrs. Palmer came up from Ashcombe when Sir Henry died, and lived out her days at Velmore, in a warm room above the still room, and made blackcurrant jelly every year until the year she went blind. And after that Louisa made it herself in the same copper pan on the same stove and sent a jar every year to the head gardener's wife's mother in the village, who lived, improbably, to be 93. And in the walled garden at Velmore, where the pear trees along the south wall bore fruit every autumn for a long time, and where the school came out in September every year to pick them, there stood, from the year Henrietta turned 5, a small wrought iron bench, on which the Duke and Duchess of Velmore, in the afternoons of their long life together, sat and did not, on most afternoons, need to say anything at all. If you have loved the story of a plain dress and a plain coat and a duke who came in disguise to a ruined baronetcy in Wiltshire, you will love, next, the story of a governess who arrived at a locked northern manor to teach a child no one would name, and the earl who, at midnight in the library, mistook her for the ghost his tenants had promised him. A stranger, a candle, a snowbound house, and a truth that neither of them could have carried alone. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories. Section 3, Video Prompts 10. Opening hook only. Opening hook. Video prompt 1 of 10. Slow cinematic wide establishing shot, drifting forward on a slow dolly, of Ashcombe Hall at dawn in late autumn. A weathered honeystone English manor house half-lit by a grey-gold sunrise. Rooks lifting from bare lime trees along a wet gravel drive. Thin mist crawling along the hedgerows. One warm candlelit window on the west wing. The east wing dark and visibly derelict with a broken slate roof. Overcast dusk blue and gold palette. No characters yet. Mood. An unpaid creditor arriving at a house pretending it is not in debt. Painterly realistic period drama cinematography. Film grain. 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Rowntree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand. No jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period-accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorble room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 2 of 10. Slow interior tracking shot moving through a cold, half-lit corridor of Ashcombe Hall, past a peeling papered wall and an empty rectangle where a painting once hung. A single candle in a plain brass holder gutters on a side table. In the far background, The small figure of Louisa Ashcombe walks quietly away from camera in her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress, dark chestnut hair in a low knot, a small piece of bread visible in the apron pocket at her waist. Soft dawn light through a leaded window. Warm, painterly muted palette. 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorble room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 3 of 10. Medium close-up, static shot of Louisa Ashcombe crouched in a weathered stone stableyard at first light, feeding the small piece of bread from her apron pocket to an old gray lurcher dog. She wears her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress, high modest neckline, floor-length skirt, sleeves to the wrist. Her calm, attentive expression, small work-worn hands, dark chestnut hair in a low knot, warm, soft gray-gold morning light, breath faintly visible in the cold, straw and cobbles textured underfoot. Painterly realistic, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusklit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 4 of 10. Interior medium shot in a faded yellow parlor at Ashcombe. Louisa Ashcombe sits at an out-of-tune pianoforte in her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress. Hands resting on the keys without pressing them. Head slightly bowed, small serious mouth, gray eyes lowered. Her father, Sir Henry Ashcombe, an aging gray-haired baronet in a worn dark blue Regency tailcoat, stands at a weakly burning fireplace with a folded letter in his hand, his face frightened. Cold October daylight through a tall window, dust motes in the air, warm, faded palette. Painterly realistic period drama, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusklit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 5 of 10. Close-up night interior of Louisa Ashcombe standing in her small bedroom in a plain white chemise fully modest, long-sleeved shift, high neckline, floor-length, a single low candle burning on the mantel, her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress laid out on the narrow bed. She stares at the dress, her expression thoughtful and resolved, gray eyes shining, dark chestnut hair in a low simple plait over one shoulder. Warm, intimate, firelit palette against deep shadow. Painterly realistic, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 6 of 10. Wide exterior tracking shot. A single rider on a bay horse approaches Ashcombe Hall along the wet lime avenue on a Friday morning of thin, cold October light. The rider is Adrian, Duke of Velmore, in his plain dark wool riding coat, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain black hat, no jewelry, deliberately unremarkable. Camera on a slow forward push behind him. Overcast sky, wet gravel, Honeystone Manor rising in the background. Painterly realistic period drama cinematography. Cool overcast palette warmed by leaf fall gold. 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 7 of 10. Interior medium two-shot in the yellow parlor at Ashcombe. Louisa Ashcombe, in her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress. Hair in a low knot, stands quietly beside a small tea tray. Adrian, Duke of Velmore, in his plain dark wool riding coat and dusty boots, sits opposite. She is pouring him a cup of tea without looking at his coat or his boots, her expression calm and courteous, treating him exactly as she would treat a visiting man of business. He watches her over the rim of his teacup, dark gray eyes attentive, faint dawning realization in his face. Warm candlelit painterly palette, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Roundtree, Duke of Velmore. 31 years old, English, fair complexion. Tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture. Quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period-accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 8 of 10. Interior slow dolly shot along the long gallery at Ashcombe. Louisa Ashcombe walks slightly ahead of Adrian in her plain dove-gray Regency long-sleeved wool day dress, gesturing quietly toward a row of portraits and the empty rectangles between them where paintings have been sold. Adrian, in the plain dark wool riding coat, follows a step behind, watching her more than the wall. Cold north light through tall gallery windows, dust in the air, warm muted painterly palette. The empty places on the wall carefully lit. Painterly realistic, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove-gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Rowntree, Duke of Velmore, 31 years old, English, fair complexion, tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture, quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms, slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame. Opening hook, video prompt 9 of 10. Close-up static shot in the long gallery. Louisa Ashcombe stands beside Adrian at the empty rectangle where a Reynolds portrait once hung. Her hands are folded in front of her at the plain cuffs of her dove gray wool sleeves. Her posture perfectly straight, her gray eyes on his. Adrian is turned 3/4 toward her, plain dark wool coat catching cool light from the tall window. His expression softening into something like recognition. Warm, painterly period drama palette, quiet emotional charge, no ornament, no jewelry, 16:9. Louisa Ashcombe, later Duchess of Velmore. 22 years old, English, pale ivory complexion, delicate oval face, soft gray eyes, dark chestnut brown hair worn plainly in a low knot at the nape of the neck with a middle parting and no ornament. Slim slight build, average height, quiet dignified posture, small serious mouth, calm attentive expression, small work-worn hands. Signature outfit. Her old plain dove gray Regency-era long-sleeved wool day dress. High modest neckline covering the collarbone, empire waist, long sleeves to the wrist, floor-length skirt, small plain white linen collar and cuffs, tiny mended stitch at the elbow, fully covered, modest, period accurate. Micromannerisms. Hands folded in front of her, still shoulders, eyes lowered briefly before speaking. Small piece of bread carried in her apron pocket. Adrian Hartley Rowntree, Duke of Velmore, 31 years old, English, fair complexion, tall lean build, dark brown hair swept back plainly, level dark gray eyes, strong straight nose, firm quiet mouth, subtle shadows of grief beneath the eyes. In disguise Friday morning at Ashcombe. Plain dark wool riding coat of no particular quality, plain buff waistcoat, dusty riding boots, plain neckcloth, plain black hat carried in one hand, no jewelry, no signet ring visible. Posture, quiet, restrained, watching more than speaking. Micromannerisms. Slight tilt of the head when listening, one hand resting on the arm of a chair, deliberate slowness of speech. Visual style lock applies to every image and every video prompt. Cinematic, painterly realistic Regency period drama aesthetic, warm, painterly palette, soft golden interior candlelight for intimacy scenes, overcast dusk-lit exteriors for tension, weathered period accurate props, authentic 1810s English Menorable room library garden settings, photographic realism with a painterly finish, high resolution, 16:9 aspect ratio, no cartoon, no anime, no stylization, no modern elements. Every female character fully covered, long sleeves, high neckline, floor-length skirt, period-accurate Regency modesty in every frame.